So far in our code, we've been using and requiring all of these node modules, for example, EJS or Express and Body Parser. But how does it actually work? If we take a look inside our node modules and we go and just find where EJS is, and we click on ejs.js, if you scroll down it, you can see that there's some variables which we already know about, there's some functions, but there's also a whole bunch of these exports, export.this, export.that. So what exactly is that? Let's try and understand how our node modules like EJS, Express, Body Parser actually work by creating a module of our own from scratch. Currently, we have this thing down here, which basically just generates the current day in a particular format that we desired. Now, if we were to refactor our code right now, then this is probably one of the first things that we want to package into its own module, because it doesn't really belong here in the app.js. You can imagine that as our app.js gets more and more complex, that we have more routes, we have different get, post routes all over the place, that code that's not strictly related to the route shouldn't actually be in here cluttering the app.js. How would you normally solve this? Well, we could go ahead and create a new file. Let's just call it date.js. And this could be our own little module for generating the current date. So let's go ahead and cut all of this code. And we're going to paste it inside date.js. And of course, we have to again say JS hint, we're using ES version 6. Now we have this date.js module, which does all of the hard work to find the date and change it to a particular format. But how do we get this day back into our app.js and use it inside our root route? Well, maybe we could wrap this thing inside a function. We could call it getDate. And this function, all it does is carries out all of this code, and then it simply returns the result of all of this. So at the end, we get this thing called day, which is what we've been previously using inside our root route. So what if we just returned day? So we get an output out of our function. Now we have this function and we have a way for it to return the thing that we want. How do we actually export it? How do we get it out of this date.js? How can we make it available elsewhere if it's needed? Well, this is where Node comes into the rescue. So if you take a look at the docs for the latest version, then if you read through all of this, maybe not all of it, but the relevant parts, then you can see that there's a section on modules. And the module object is basically something that gives you a reference to the object that represents the current module. So that means that inside this module here, date.js, we have access to this thing called module. And I can go ahead and just log my module. And if I were to use this module, then I can require this module to run all the code inside here. So for example, up here, instead of requiring Body Parser and Express, I'm going to create a new const called date. And this simply requires my new little date module. Now, because our module is local and it's not installed using npm, then the way we access it is a little bit different. We have to use that thing that we saw previously with the directory name plus, and then we have to locate our date.js. So now what this will do is we're saying we're requiring a module and it's located at the current directory name. And then we add /.js in order to access this particular file. So now if I hit save and I run my code using node app.js, making sure that you're in the right position, then I will end up with my module printed out inside my console. So whenever I say require this module, then it will go into this module and it'll try to run all of this code. Now, over here, you can see what it's running is that log statement. And we've logged that module object. So this is the object that represents our date module. And you can see it's got a whole bunch of interesting things in here. For example, an ID. So this is where it's located, which currently is in my local directory, right? Something called webdev/dolus v1/date.js, which is where you can see it here. And then you've got a whole bunch of other things, such as it's got a parent module, right? What was the module that actually launched it or required it? Well, in this case, it's something called app.js. And that thing has a whole bunch of children, including this date module. So we've also got other children, such as Express and Body Parser and EJS. And it's also got other things associated to it. Now, if we take a look at our module object that represents our date module, you can see it's also got this property called exports. And export seems to be some sort of JavaScript object, as denoted by those curly braces. But at the moment, it's completely empty. So there is nothing that our module is exporting. If we take a look back at the documentation and we navigate to this part where it talks about module.exports, then you can see that this is also a JavaScript object and it's created by the module system. So what it allows us to do is to basically say module.exports do something or is equal to something, and then that means that in another file we can simply tap into that module and use some of those exports. So let me show it to you in our code. Now, instead of console logging our module, we can simply write module.exports. Remember the S, this is a really common mistake. And then we set it to equal, say, hello world, maybe. Now, this current date module exports the string that's hello world. So if we go back into our app.js, whenever we require our module, it gets bound to something called date. And over here, we can simply log our date object, and that will be equal to whatever it is that we exported out of this module. So now if I head back into my console and I stop my server and rerun it, you can see that my app.js is now printing hello world. There's no log statements over here. And this is because I'm exporting from this module just a simple string, and it's now available inside my app.js. Now that we're able to get access to the exports from this module, what if we wanted to get access to a function instead? For example, what if we wanted to be able to tap into this function? Well, if instead of setting our module.exports to equal hello world, we can set it to equal getDate. Now, the important thing with JavaScript object is when you decide to add the parentheses. Because the time when you add the parentheses, then that means we're actually calling, we're activating the function, right? And we don't want to do that inside our module because we want to allow the app.js to determine when that function should be called. So currently, our date object here is bound to the exports of our date module, and the exports of our date module is simply just a function. So if I were to log date as it is right now, you can see that it's only going to tell me that it's just a function and it's called getDate. It's not going to actually run that function and give me the return statement, which is the actual date that I'm looking for. If I want it to run, then I have to add my parentheses. So now when I rerun my app.js, you can see now it's running the function getDate rather than just logging the actual function. Now, by binding our exports to this function inside the module, we're now able to export it into our app.js, and we can use it anywhere we like. So we don't have to activate it when we require it. We can add it wherever it's needed. So for example, inside our app.get, we're now able to say date run whatever is bound to that module, and let's say we save it inside something called day, right? So now we have this thing called day, which is bound to the output of this date module, which currently is getting us the current date because it's running this function getDate. What we're saying here is we have this module called date, and we're requiring it up here, which binds all of the exports to this constant called date. And then down here, we call the function that's bound to that constant date, and we activate our getDate function. And now we have the result of it stored inside day, which we're going to pass over here. Now we're able to head over to our console and run our app.js. And now if we head over to our localhost 3000, you can see it's passing the output of that date module into our title over here. So we've managed to move our date code out of our app.js, put it into its own separate module, and we're able to use it inside app.js or any other file for that matter. And now this code in our date.js is completely reusable. We can require it and use it anywhere we like. But what if we wanted our date module to do more than one thing? Because at the moment, all it exports is just one function, right? It kind of makes its functionality quite limited. What if we had, say, another function right down here? Let's say we had a function, instead of getDate, it gets the day, right? The current day of the week. And pretty much all of this is the same other than this option. We only want the weekday to be in a long format. And then we bind it to this thing called day, and we return it as the output of this function. Now, because our module.exports is only bound to our getDate function, we can't seem to access this getDay. How can we solve this? Well, if you remember previously, I mentioned that module.exports is a JavaScript object, and objects have properties and methods associated with it. So that means that instead of simply binding the entire object to our getDate function, I could say module.exports.getDate is equal to this function. And that means that I can do the same thing down here and say module.exports.getDay is equal to the getDay function. So now, if at the end of all of this code, we log our module.exports and we go back into our app.js and require that module, then you can see that currently our exports object now has two functions that are tied to it. One is called getDay and one is called getDate. Now, inside our app.js, instead of saying just run the function that's bound to the exports from our date module, we can say run the function that's bound to our date module dot getDate. And this will work exactly the same way as before. So I can restart my server and you can see that it's still working as expected. But now I have the option of saying, oh, maybe instead I just want the actual day of the week. So now if I go ahead and restart my server and refresh my website, you can see I'm using the getDay function inside our date module to just bring up the actual day of the week. This is how we can create our own modules and require them and get their functionality exported out of the module to be used anywhere within our project. So this makes it reusable and way more useful. So this is the first step in our refactoring. Now, the next step is how can we make this a little bit more succinct? How can we make it a bit shorter? Because at the moment, it's quite wordy, right? So for example, here, where we're creating let day equals this and then return day, then we can simply get rid of all of this and just say return this, right? So we can now delete that, and we can do the same over here. We can simply just return that without having to bind it to another variable. The next thing we can look at is, for example, here we're saying module.exports.getDate equals getDate, function getDate. There's getDate like all over the place, right? So how can we simplify this? Well, you might remember from earlier lessons that we mentioned that JavaScript functions can be declared in a variety of ways. And in the course resources, I'll link to this particular blog post, which does a really good job of summarizing the 6 different ways that you can declare JavaScript functions. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. Now, the way that we're most used to is just a simple function declaration. It's the function keyword, the name of the function, some inputs, and maybe some outputs, right? Now, another way of doing this is by using a function expression. We could set our function to equal a variable instead. And this means that we can pass our function around whenever we need it. So now we have an anonymous function that's set to equal a variable with a name. And whenever we need that functionality, we simply just refer to it by its name. So let's implement it to understand it a bit better. Instead of having our getDate as a normal JavaScript function, I'm going to change it into an anonymous function. So this function doesn't have a name anymore. And instead, we're going to bind it to a variable that's called getDate. And now this getDate variable is bound to our anonymous function. And you can see now this is a little bit clearer. Instead of saying module.exports.getDate equals getDate, which is basically the contents of everything after the equal sign, then we can simply delete all of this and say module.exports.getDate is now equal to this anonymous function. And this means that we save on 2 getDates and we make everything a little bit more succinct. Let's go ahead and do the same thing over here. Let's delete this name of the function to turn it into an anonymous function, and we're simply going to set that function to equal module.exports.getDay. Now we can make this even shorter by reading through our Node.js documentation, because if you scroll down a little bit, you can see that Node.js actually provides an exports shortcut because just how often it's used. So instead of using module.exports, we can simply just use the exports variable to refer to exactly the same thing. So here, instead of saying module.exports, we can just say exports for short, and it will refer to the same thing, which is module.exports. So now let's hit save. I'm going to delete this console log, and over here in my app.js, I'm using date.getDate from my date module, and I'm rendering it as my list title. So if we go ahead and launch our app now with NodeMon to save ourselves the effort of restarting our server all the time, then we can refresh and you can see our app works exactly the same. Now, while we're refactoring, we might as well try and refactor the rest of our code. For example, we've got a lot of lets around here. So these are variables, but actually these variables are never going to vary. So we can simply change it to const here as well, and const down here. Now, because we're never really reassigning the values of today or options, then this won't change our code at all. It still works exactly the same way. Now, back in our app.js, we can do some more of that refactoring. For example, here where we're changing the items array into a const, and you might say, hey, wait a minute, we're going to change this, right? We're going to add new items to this array. So how can we make it a constant? Well, this is a little bit of a quirk of JavaScript, and it's not this way in some languages, and it varies from language to language. But for JavaScript, at least, if you take a look at the MDN docs for const, and you scroll down at some of their examples, you can see that when they talk about arrays, when we create a constant, which is an array, it's actually possible to push new items into the array, but it's not possible to simply assign it to a brand new array. This is one of the things that doesn't really stay constant. The other thing that doesn't stay constant is when you have an object and you can't change that object into an entirely new object, right? This will throw an error because my object was declared as constant. But if you try to change one of the values that's associated with one of the keys inside the object, then you actually can, even though this thing is a constant. So it's important to remember that when you declare something as constant in JavaScript, it's not protecting the things that's inside that thing. So inside the array or inside the object, you're still able to vary those things. You just can't assign it to a new, entirely different object or array. So that means over here, if we change all of those lets to consts, then it will still work just as well, and we won't actually come into any problems. So let's hit save, and NodeMon's updating our server behind the scenes and refresh our website. You can see that we're still getting the dates here, and we're still able to add items into our array and cross them out as needed. So I hope you enjoyed learning about EJS and templating with me in this module. In the next module, we're going to see if you can apply everything that we learned about EJS and templating into your very own project. So head over to the challenge once you're ready.